floor.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Melvin from Temasek, and it's truly a privilege to be here in Belém. Coming from Singapore, where it's clean and green, but still very much an urban paradise, I wanted to visit somewhere very different. I think I found it here. So welcome to Eco-Prosperity Conversations at COP30, and we're delighted to have you with us. So I lead Eco-Prosperity, which is Temasek's sustainability, thought leadership, and advocacy platform. Today, together with AIGCC, we're tackling a key theme in climate finance, adaptation, and resilience. Our goal today is to make it real, tangible, and very much focused on value creation. But before we dive into the panel, a quick word about Temasek and Eco-Prosperity. So Temasek started in 1974, so a little over 50 years ago, with a portfolio value of $350 million. Today, that very portfolio stands at about $434 billion. We have grown 1,200 times, implying a 14% CAGR since inception. We are wholly owned by the government of Singapore, but we operate independently and fully on commercial principles. We're now also a global investor. We operate across 13 offices spanning 9 countries. Now, sustainability is at our core because we believe a resilient planet builds a resilient and thriving portfolio. And as a generation investor, we always invest with tomorrow firmly on our minds. And I think our purpose statement captures it best. So our purpose statement is, so every generation prospers. Not only for this current generation, but all future generations of Singaporeans. So how do we make sustainability real at Temasek? We view it through 3 key tenets and 5 levers. The 3 key tenets are, we strive for net zero portfolio emissions by 2050. We also strive to be nature positive. And last but not least, seek inclusive growth. Now, the 5 key levers that we use to action these 3 key tenets are, first, we invest in sustainability. We put our money where our mouth is. As at 31st March 2025, $46 billion or 46 billion Sing dollars worth of investments are sustainable living trend-aligned investments. Second, in terms of evaluating investments, ESG principles are integrated from end to end. That means all the way from pre-deal diligence to post-deal engagement. Within that, also second, we use an internal carbon price to guide our actions. That was first incepted in 2021 with a starting level of $42 per ton. It's grown to $65 now, and it will rise to US $100 by 2030. Third, for our portfolio engagement, we have 2 frameworks. First of which is the Climate Transition Readiness Framework, and also second, the ESG Value Creation Playbook. Internally, we are also proud to announce that we have achieved a 28% lower carbon intensity, average carbon intensity per employee compared to pre-COVID levels. But last but not least, we look for collaboration because we believe in partnerships because no one reaches net zero by going at it alone. The proof in the pudding, the proof lies in the pudding. So here, what we have tried to do is to highlight some key actions from all the way ranging from green investments to decarbonizing industries. But I think the real power lies in partnerships, the catalysts that make transformation possible, which brings me to Eco-Prosperity. So Eco-Prosperity, just a quick primer, Eco-Prosperity started very small. It was a half-day internal session with fewer than 100 people. Today, it's a global platform connecting investors, innovators, and change makers, turning sustainability ideas into action. Our flagship event, Eco-Prosperity Week, is one of the leading global sustainability gatherings as it continues to go from strength to strength. In this year's edition, we have more than 4,000 participants, 3/4 of which are senior leaders in their respective industries, and 1/3 of them came from overseas. So it's very much a dynamic mix of ideas, energy, and collaboration. We think this serves us very well because at Eco-Prosperity, we are very much action-oriented and outcomes-focused. Now, before I close, a very quick friendly plug. After all, what is an introduction without a teaser? So for next year, Eco-Prosperity Week 2026 will take place from 18 to 21st May in Singapore at the Marina Bay Sands Convention Center. The theme for next year will be Asia's Race Towards 2030, powered by innovation, driven with intent. And we hope to see you there. Now, to wrap up, Temasek has grown from $350 million to $434 billion today, guided by one purpose: so every generation prospers. Our sustainability strategy rests on 3 tenets and 5 key levers. And through ecosperity, we aim to turn vision into action, bringing together capital, ideas, and people for a more resilient future. Thank you, and with that, I'll pass the reins over to Rebecca. Rebecca, please.
Good morning, everybody. Great to have you here. Thank you, Alvin. But thank you, Temasek, and indeed the Singapore government for really highlighting adaptation resilience at COP this year, but actually for many years now. And we're really privileged to be able to work with you all and look forward to the panel session shortly. So I'm just going to introduce myself briefly and then just provide a bit of context for the panel today. So my name's Rebecca Mikula-Wright. I'm the CEO of the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, but also covering the Investor Group on Climate Change that covers Australia and New Zealand. So we're an investor set up by investors 8 years ago now. We work with investors on their investor practice, how climate risks and opportunities are incorporated into their policies, processes and portfolios from sort of asset allocation level. We facilitate corporate engagement with some of the world and the region's most systemically important emitters as part of global initiatives. And we also facilitate engagement with policy makers and regulators across the region so that we can scale up capital flows into to address the risks and also to take advantage of some of the opportunities that climate change presents, as we're going to hear a bit more about. So I'm just going to provide some numbers around and get into some of how we're looking to, how we need to continue to sort of finance and scale up action, but really importantly, capital. AIGCC has sort of about 85 members across the Asia region, but domestic and international investors, sovereign wealth funds, government pension funds, asset managers, all members of the investment value chain, with $35 trillion in assets under management. But that's $35 trillion we have to get more mobilised towards, addressing some of these solutions. So just to start to put some numbers around this. So we know we know some of the numbers around physical risk. But just to really put this in context of what we're talking about here. I think yesterday we heard some of the global economic losses from natural disasters. We've got some numbers from the insurers and climate catastrophe reporting, $368 billion in 2024. Actually, we heard numbers here yesterday that was actually in the trillions in annual losses. So obviously sort of a broader scope of numbers there. But we're seeing that, this is affecting balance sheets already. And we're seeing that a recent study by MSCI, 80% of companies report being impacted by extreme weather events in the last 5 years, and 57% of investors and risk professionals are reporting sooner than anticipated economic fallout from these extreme weather events. We do have a gap to fill. We're going to need around 310 to 365 billion annually by 2035, according to the UN Adaptation Gap Report, and only less than 10% of that is currently coming from private sources. And so I think there's an investor need and desire to address this gap because government balance sheets can't finance this alone, but that is where the majority of funding is coming from now. So we have, I think in COP29 last year, the new collective quantified goal on climate finance really reflected the need to scale up that adaptation finance and is really calling on all actors to get to that 1.3 trillion per year by 2035 that new goal outlined. So adaptation resilience isn't an optional future head. It's a key part of current day enterprise value that we need to address. So we have undertaken a survey every year of investors across the region. This accounts for around 230 investors across the region with around US 46 trillion in assets under management. We are seeing progress on awareness and disclosure of physical risks by investors, but it's not nearly where it needs to be. So 65% are integrating it into their physical, the risks into investment processes, and 43% of those have disclosed their assessments, up from 31%. But assessment and disclosure is one thing, and implementation is a whole nother story that we need to get into. So how are investors doing this? Well, about 56% at the moment are engaging in their stewardship of the companies that they're part owners of, around governance oversight, capital allocation, and disclosures. So that's a good trend that it's starting to get incorporated, but it's very early days. And we'll talk a bit more later about the company preparedness around that and some of the gaps and challenges around that. But we need to see a lot more. We need to see more data, more metrics, and we need to see how that's pulled together to make it material for investors in their decision making. 50% of respondents from the survey are looking at public and private finance mechanisms, that it needs to be a priority for governments, and we're facilitating investor engagement with governments. And then we're looking into structures such as resilience bonds, risk-sharing models, and blended finance vehicles to mobilise capital. So just moving on, some of the other work that we've done through this program, we have a dedicated physical risk and resilience working group with our members. And a couple of years ago, we outlined the investor expectations at one of the previous COPs around the national adaptation planning processes. And that these processes are really significant because it enables countries to identify and address their medium and long-term priorities for adaptation measures, and what are the systems and capabilities that they need to make adaptation an integral part of their development planning, decision-making, and very importantly, budgeting. But it's really how they work with the private sector then to match those two things together, so investors can start to co-invest alongside governments. And so that's why the national adaptation forms a really key part of these building blocks for certainty for investors to bring those private capital flows in. So this year we conducted an assessment of 9 Asian markets' national adaptation plans, and then we benchmarked it against 7 investor expectations, and then mapped it against certain elements of the National Adaptation Plan process. We do have that online kind of benchmark available through the AIGCC website. But across these 9 markets, we saw some of the key priorities that we need to work with governments to help stimulate private investment. So some of these high-level ones are having more granular climate risk information publicly available and accessible, and this needs to be ideally legislated and then regularly updated, over sort of several year intervals. We need to set up ministerial level engagement with private sector and financial institutions, and we need to see clear and established sort of action-oriented strategies for adaptation financing. So just in terms of some of the gaps that we're seeing in this space, so across those 3 areas you see there, so the data and capability set, we really need, there is a lot of data and there are a lot of tools out there, but it's actually bringing it together in decision useful ways. So we need, granular climate hazard data, supply chain vulnerability mapping, adaptation cost benefit analytics. These are all quite underdeveloped despite sort of the data and the tools that are currently out there. We really need to bring them together. A lot of markets across the region have interministerial or interagency coordination on adaptation planning, but there are big gaps that remain around availability and accessibility of this climate risk data. Again, that's decision useful for investments. There's a few good platforms in the region. We're seeing Vestap in Korea and APLAT in Japan have demonstrated some potential on how governments can enhance transparency and accessibility of data on climate hazards and risks. But we're yet to see a lot of other markets have developed similar platforms, and then how they communicate these assessments effectively, particularly at sector level. We need to start seeing adaptation built into sector plans that are currently being developed at sort of the sector level and subnational levels as well. On the bankability gap, the projects are struggling to generate viable revenue streams. And so there's uncertainty around how investors can, work within this to finance the development and work in this NAP process. The disclosure and within these national adaptation plans, we need to have an investment plan that clearly sets that out with priority infrastructure projects, for example, at national level. So investors it's clearly signposting where they might be able to direct their investments. And of course, we're seeing the mandatory climate risk disclosure that's starting to come up throughout the region with different timelines. This is still inconsistent at the moment, and we really need to see that increase in disclosure across the region, and that will really help investors as well. And just finally, to wrap up, so just a couple of opportunities, and then we'll get more into this in the panel. There are opportunities out there. There are things happening now. And GIC, Singapore's other sovereign fund, also released a great report this year with Temasek that are really complementary. And they estimate the total opportunity to rise from 2 trillion now to 9 trillion by 2050. And that universe that can grow for private equity investors is looking at sort of half to over 1.3 trillion per year. Sorry, wrong slide. By 2030. So very imminent opportunities available now. And some of the sectors we're seeing where opportunities might be possible: agriculture, water supply, efficiency, infrastructure and cooling. One of the key barriers here is how we monetize this for sort of diffused and long-term benefits of these projects into more predictable financial return flows. We're seeing really great investor appetite for some of these new vehicles that have been bundled up. The first of its kind Tokyo Metropolitan Government Resilience Bond, just recently 7 times oversubscribed, over 120 investors. There's more bonds being released this week from Brazil and Latin America, again with resilience portions to them. The AIIB Climate Adaptation Bond, second issuance. So we're starting to see things come through, and we have a resilience fund by Climate Works Foundation and Philanthropies, which are really critical to help build the capacity in this space across all stakeholders and actors. That $50 million fund there. So with that, hopefully that provides a little bit of context setting where we're up to. And now I'll invite Kyung-Ah from Temasek to come up, and we'll get into the panel. Thanks, Kyung-Ah.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I have the privilege of actually moderating this esteemed panel. In the interest of time, I'm not going to introduce their bios, otherwise we'll take the full discussion given how illustrious their backgrounds are, but there is a QR code if you want to actually check out their bio. But let me welcome my fellow panelists, Tong Yen with Keppel, Neely with Carbon Direct, and then Leslie with Louders Foundation, and you heard from Rebecca at AIGCC. What I'm going to do is start with a very quick lightning round and ask them for any immediate reactions to AIGCC's presentation, either any surprises or any additional perspectives that you want to add. And as part of that, just do a very quick intro on their company so that at least you know where their perspectives are coming from. So we'll just go around in order, starting with you.
Thank you. Maybe I'll begin by introducing myself. I'm Chief Sustainability Officer at Keppel. Now, Keppel, if we were having a conversation a decade ago, I'll be telling you that Keppel is one of the world's biggest builders of jack-up rigs. So we're squarely in the oil and gas space. But over the past decade, we've transformed. We've exited the rig building business. And we now use the same engineering capabilities to look at developing solutions that contribute to decarbonization and sustainability, connectivity, and so on. So that's about the company. In terms of the presentation earlier, I thought it's fascinating. Firstly, I agree. I think a lot of adaptation and resilience is an international public good. So it faces all the challenges associated with making a case for investing in public goods. But I would say that, and again, the report says that as well, there's been a lot of progress since TCFD was launched about a decade ago. I think companies today have a lot more disclosures. In fact, the conversation now is not so much about whether you do something about it, but to what extent what is the appropriate level of disclosure that companies should be making. So I think the world has progressed. There are many companies exploring opportunities and risks associated with climate change, and Keppel is one of them.
Okay, great. Neely?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here at COP30 and in the Singapore Pavilion. I'm Neely Gilbert. I'm the Vice Chairwoman of Carbon Direct. And Carbon Direct, we actually have 2 separate companies. As vice chair, I sit across both, but most people are sitting in one or the other. You have Carbon Direct Capital, where we're investing in climate solutions including nature-based solutions and technologies for industrial decarbonization. On the other side of the business, you have our client-facing scientific advisory business. If you only remember one thing about Carbon Direct, please let it be our science team, which is about 90 people, over 70 PhDs on staff working to solve these problems and meet these opportunities. So, Rebecca, in your presentation, one thing that stood out for me and I'm looking forward to learning more about is the mapping that you did on the national adaptation plans. And this is a really timely topic also here at COP. For private finance, the ability to understand how financing opportunities connect up into holistic policy thinking and frameworks is extremely important for national adaptation plans as well as for NDCs. How does that fall down into sector-specific transition plans, supportive policies, frameworks, and taxonomies that allow us to move capital forward?
Wonderful. And thank you for having me, and thank you, Singapore, for the opportunity. My name is Leslie Johnson, and I'm the CEO of Loudest Foundation, which is a proud funder of the work that Rebecca just walked through. And Loudest is a private foundation based in Switzerland that's trying to accelerate the decarbonization of 4 industries while keeping people at the center. So adaptation and resilience is very much part of what we do. And in terms of the reaction to the presentation, one thing that really struck me is what you said at the very end, which is the role of philanthropy to really build the field and build capacity. And you had referenced it at all as well, but recently we launched with a few other foundations this Adaptation and Resilience Fund, which effectively is trying to build the architecture for adaptation and resilience. And what does that mean? That means providing funding for grassroots organizations. It means creating new innovative financing mechanisms like parametric insurance, I could talk about later. It means actually trying to influence the rules of the system, so there could be a policy play. It also means strengthening the cities and the way the cities can move. And we just had our first RFP and had, I think, about 2,000 applicants. Maybe some of them are in the room. So you can be sure there's a demand for it. So thank you for calling that out, and thank you for your great work.
I think we heard from Rebecca, so we'll skip Rebecca for now. But this is a great framing because you're hearing, obviously, the business case for both the gray to green transition and the business opportunity to both invest and obviously advise clients and the scientific aspect of things, and then also the role of philanthropy and investors as well. So we'll explore that. But before we go into the specifics, a couple of thoughts, just reacting again to the presentation. So as Alvin mentioned, sustainability is really at the core of everything we do. So we have been looking to invest more into sustainability. You saw the $46 billion number to date. But we did a report together with BCG that Rebecca referenced. And what it did was do a deep dive into the private equity investment opportunities in this space and go very deep into the sectoral aspects, some of which was called out, like climate intelligence, climate resilient building materials, all the way through adaptive ag, and even looking at emergency medical systems. So these are becoming investable, both in the private market and in the public market. We've also done an engagement with many of our portfolio companies, which Keppel was part of. And one of the observations that we had from that, but also more broadly some of these conversations that we've been privy to, is I think it's fair to say that adaptation resiliency, I think, has gone from what has been a reactive risk function after the weather extremes or natural catastrophes happened, to now much more of a preventative aspect, really looking at how do you actually do value protection? And we'll talk a bit more about how do you actually then monetize for that, which is really about cost avoidance. But the holy grail is how do you make it a strategic agenda where you're capturing the opportunities and actually going for value creation. And that's certainly for investors, but also very much a CEO-led strategic agenda for CEOs. So let's double click into some of those aspects and start with a high-level perspective on what are we actually seeing in terms of financing flows and what's happening on the ground and what are the challenges. And I'm going to start with Neely because she has both a nature-based solutions purview with Carbon Direct, but she also sits on the board of Brookfield, which is one of the biggest asset managers and infrastructure investors, and also on Rockefeller Fund as well. So from your purview, what are you seeing? in terms of the flows and what are the challenges?
So I'm excited to talk from both sides of the aisle, from nature all the way up into hard real assets. On nature-based solutions at Carbon Direct, we invest and advise in this space through projects that generate carbon credits. In our standards for high-integrity carbon removal, which we publish annually with Microsoft, we point to the fact that there's a lot of work you need to do to define carbon integrity, but focusing on integrity around adaptation and resilience is also extremely important in evaluating the durability of projects. Adaptation and resilience, tools like introducing biodiversity helps to improve watersheds, minimize flood risk, fire risk, and other interventions like this. So this needs to be a part of just how we think about what a good project is. And the challenge, of course, is how do we get those markets to scale? These projects are often primarily funded through voluntary carbon markets, and increased standards for integrity and quality will be a big part of getting more buyers to come to the table. Singapore, and through Temasek and also Gen Zero, has been a leader in advancing these practices, not only in the voluntary carbon markets, but also through Article 6.2 transactions. And one of the things that we are calling for here at COP is greater connection between those regulated government carbon markets and the voluntary carbon markets. And we need to see standards that advance adaptation and resilience come forward in both. And then I would also say just a little word for the role that community engagement and community benefits planning provides in developing resilient projects. When communities have ownership, government rights, decision making, this also helps projects to be more resilient over time. From the Brookfield asset management side of the business, hopefully many of you know Brookfield. This is a company that invests private capital, and we call it the backbone of the global economy: infrastructure, real estate, a lot in renewable energy and transition assets. I sit on the board of directors, and the board's role, of course, is risk management and as well as long-term value creation, to your point, Kyung-ah. And on the risk management side, it's just part of fiduciary duty to understand and manage the physical risks that may present themselves to our assets. This requires holistic thinking as well as very localized, place-based and asset-by-asset understanding. And our investment teams doing their job are always also very keen on identifying ways in which increasing adaptation and resilience increases the value of those assets. And we do find those opportunities in many places.
Thank you, Neely. And for those of you who may have missed this, yesterday we had a great event, exactly to the point, on growing the Coalition to Grow Carbon Markets, which has brought a number of governments together, including UK, Singapore, and Kenya, to be able to bring the government imprimatur to the voluntary carbon market. So the connectivity hopefully will continue. But let me turn to you, Rebecca, because as you mentioned, you have a very big purview with working with many different investors. And from your perspective, you could just double click a bit into your presentation as well and pick up what Neely said around, how are investors actually integrating adaptation resilience on the one hand, because it sounds like it's just normal course, just good investment practice, but also what are you seeing from a flow perspective, what more needs to happen?
I think it's great to hear the example of Brookfield and what they're doing. And I would say, they're probably a real leader in this space. I think we need to have a lot of fast followers that come with them. So we're seeing some progress. So investors are looking at starting to do asset level assessments on some of their assets, and then using these assessments to engage with these assets at a high level. And at the same time, they're engaging with policymakers and regulators to try and close that gap and speed up that process. But just to dive into some specific examples for Asian utilities, we're shortly releasing a report in about 2 weeks we have a utilities engagement program, and we've actually looked at 7 utilities across the region and nearly 2,500 of their assets, underlying assets, and the direct asset exposure, just to try and drill down into what kind of disclosure is out there. There is a lot, but how granular is it? Is it enough or not? So the utilities are looking at having costs of around $6.3 billion annually in asset damages and lost revenue each year. The costs are going to go up 33% to exceed around $8.5 billion by 2050 under a medium to high warming trajectory without adaptation measures. Heat is the biggest impact, followed by flooding and extreme precipitation. So across these 9 criteria, we look at exposure and vulnerability, governance and risk management, implementation and capital allocation. 9 of these 11 utilities conducted scenario analysis. Great, that's a good high number, but only 7 at a site level. Only 5 have quantified and disclosed the forward-looking physical risk impacts through increased costs and reduced earnings. None of those utilities have disclosed adaptation-related expenditures or their policy engagement actions. So that just kind of gives you a level of, okay, you start to look at the high level, but when you drill down, how much information is there? And there's kind of less and less. So this is what investors are doing, looking across their very high exposed assets, obviously the utilities, the dependencies of that particular sector for other sectors. So that's a key focus. So investors have to look where their biggest exposures are, how they can engage with them. And they're also doing this collaboratively because investors, they don't have enough resources. They don't have enough people compared to sort of the companies to address this. So we're trying to build that investor capacity. At the same time, we have to do the corporate engagement. At the same time, we have to do the policy and regulatory engagement. We have to take this systems approach. And we are seeing this is speeding things up. We're getting policymakers, companies and investors in the room in Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan. We want to do this in other markets, and that's helping to accelerate these conversations instead of these bilateral conversations. So we've got all this access now, but now we need to build capacity at all these different levels. So we're doing everything everywhere kind of all at once, but we're really starting from quite a low base, generally speaking. So I might leave it there. We can dig into some more things.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really hits home, because we integrate physical risk as well, and I think it's fair to say among many investors we have this conversation where you are now getting to understand the exposure because you have a lot of data providers as well as ideally geolocation data, but assessing what is the true vulnerability, how do you measure for that cost, and what are companies actually doing to actually reduce that, whether it's diversification, de-risking, or whether it's adaptation measures, is incredibly hard. But we're lucky because we actually have a practitioner here who both has an asset management arm, but also does the actual infrastructure development. So we'd love to hear from you, Tong Yen. Like, what are you doing vis-a-vis both the risk management side of the equation, but also where you're seeing the opportunities? If you can give some examples of this, that would be very helpful.
Thank you. Well, firstly, I think there are a few ways that companies are looking at climate risks and adaptation. Firstly, I must acknowledge that the Singapore government has taken a very active role in really setting the agenda, including having a pavilion like this, really to increase awareness, and shareholders like yourselves have also been stewards in this regard. So for us, there are 3 ways to think about it. First, in terms of looking at climate risk. Now, this is standard for any investment. Our investors, the limited partners we work with, will all expect us to look at climate risk. At the operational level, we will be raising the platform of important infrastructure to ensure that they are ready for rising sea levels. In terms of work sites, especially with outdoor exposure, we'll be ensuring that workers are better prepared to deal with extreme weather conditions in terms of shade, hydration, and so on. So these are the operational level decisions that are taken. The next thing is, in terms of looking at opportunities, I think there's huge demand for such solutions. So Keppel is developing a number of them. For example, we are a pioneer in renewable energy importation into Singapore. We are developing Singapore's first hydrogen-ready power plant, which will start operating in first half of next year, so it's just months away. We also developed and are operating Singapore's first dual-mode water treatment plant that can treat both seawater and reservoir water. So that allows the treatment of water to be more energy efficient compared to pure desalination. And at the same time, it better prepares Singapore for rainfall uncertainty associated with climate change. So definitely an adaptation angle to it. And on top of it, Brookfield is a leader in this space, but Keppel has also morphed to become an asset manager and operator. So we are able to work with limited partners, many of whom want exposure to these real assets that are not readily available on the market. But through a partner like Keppel, they can come in, they would be able to work with us and invest in these assets. And along the way, it's a viable model for us because we are able to earn fee income, right, both from an asset management perspective and in terms of operating the assets. So we find that there's a viable business model for us to look at various climate-related solutions.
I think you're hearing the integrated approach is actually very important. We heard that on the nature-based solution side. We're now hearing it on the infrastructure side because oftentimes people view water as just an infrastructure project, but it does have climate mitigation, but also climate resiliency, and being able to integrate revenue, I think makes it a lot more investable. But you also touched upon some of the worker components. So let me turn to Leslie. You have again, you work with a lot of companies across the built environment, fashion, and so forth. But you're integrating the E-component alongside the adaptation resilience and really thinking about the people aspect of things. But philanthropy has finite dollars. So how do you prioritize and think about adaptation resilience in the context of your scarce dollars and mobilizing private capital?
Great. I think you hit it on the nail on the head with philanthropy has finite dollars because actually, does anyone know how much philanthropy is out there in the world today? Total number? It's less than $1 trillion all over the world, and that includes all kind of philanthropy. 2% of that is climate related, so it's not very much at all. However, that said, I think what I said before in terms of philanthropy can actually be more of that market maker or that enabler to unlock the more private and even public investment that needs to come in. And there's different ways that we do that. So when we're looking at industries and we want to actually decarbonize industries at scale and pace, but do it in a way that puts people at the center, what we like to look at is what's the barriers that keeps companies from doing that. And a very good example, and I say this being very hot right now, is around extreme heat. Because extreme heat is a really big deal in factories when you're a fashion company, because your workers will be suffering. And it actually is very harmful for people's health, especially women, and fertility rates. In fact, there was a report that just came out a couple days ago by Climate Resilience for All that looks at extreme heat over the last couple decades. And the story is very scary. So we need to address that. So what can philanthropy do in that specific example? Well, first we need to shine a light on it. But more importantly, we need to support the initiatives that can actually unlock a market mechanism to address this. It's one thing to take a charitable view and say, look, we need to kind of look at the symptoms. It's another thing to actually take a market view and say, what could be in place to actually address this and protect the workers? And that's where an insurance scheme like parametric insurance comes into play because it's linked to temperatures. And when you hit that temperature, the insurance scheme plays out. But it's really hard to put those schemes in. It's not a natural market, and there's a mindset shift. You need to help the workers understand this is not a guaranteed payout. You need to let the insurance companies understand what the opportunity is. They need to manage risk and return. The companies need to see the benefit for it and put some money in the pot. So I see philanthropy as almost the orchestrator of all these different players to put in place, hopefully, a scheme that the market that can then take on and scale.
Great, thank you. And Rebecca mentioned also the technical capacity. You mentioned the $50 million fund to be able to do that. So building capacity and then being able to catalyze more. And I see our CEO of FASP, who's been very hard at work working on blended finance mechanism to unlock private capital. So maybe 2.0 or 3.0, maybe around adaptation, resiliency, and nature. Planting a few seeds there for you. Yeah. But the other thing which I found quite interesting, as I mentioned earlier, is around how do you actually price for these things and think about the return on investment? we talked a bit about, it was fascinating to see. I'm not going to call out names except for one that is public because some of these were in closed door sessions. But Zurich Insurance, I think this is public available, was talking about how they have had deep engineering capabilities to help clients be able to take adaptive measures and then price for that. And then it was fascinating to see Tokyo Marine in Japan just acquired an engineering design company exactly with that in mind. So it does feel like now you are starting to see some preventative measures and costing for that. I also wonder about credit rating agencies. Do they give enough benefit for adaptation resiliency measures, both for the private sector, but country resilience as well? And then obviously the holy grail is how do you actually think about the revenue stream and the opportunity sets? So I'd love to be able to double click a little bit more into that if you can share. And I'll start with you. Given you mentioned you do see investable opportunity sets as well. What are you seeing in pricing signals? And are you seeing more opportunities to be able to monetize revenue streams and bring capital to opportunity sets? And obviously that also goes hand in hand with the National Adaptation Plan. If you could just double click on some tangible examples and also perhaps even talk a bit about G2G opportunities, because you've been at the center of some of the green industrial parks and green parks as well globally.
Thank you. No, I think there are definitely challenges, so let me not downplay those. But at the same time, there are ways to monetize these opportunities. In Singapore, for example, carbon tax. All right, one of the most obvious implications of carbon tax is that it would channel more investments into cleaner sources of energy, and that's something that's happening. Yesterday, Ambassador Ravi talked about Singapore's Long Island project, where the idea is to actually build a long island along the Singapore's eastern coast, which serves as both protection from rising sea levels, while creating opportunities for real estate, for recreation. So there is a monetizable angle to doing coastal protection, rather than purely as public spending. And you mentioned Tianjin Eco-City. I used to be the CEO of the joint venture in China. What's interesting about the project is that it started in 2008 as a collaboration between Singapore and China. So that's 7 years before Paris Agreement, many years before SDGs. Right? But at that time, the thinking was that we can work together to develop a city that meets many environmental criteria. And China set as one of the criteria in terms of site selection, it must be a place that is dry, lacking in fresh water. So in some ways, although we weren't talking about the language of climate risk at that time, inherent in that thinking is dealing with climate change. Right? And one of the things that was done to make it viable is that attractive land price was given to the joint venture, but in return, you have to set higher environmental KPIs in terms of renewable energy utilization, in terms of green transportation, in terms of green building standards, and so on and so forth. So, more than 15 years have passed. The city that started from really wasteland has now more than 150,000 people. It's demonstrating that with the right incentive structures in place, you are able to encourage green developments that contribute to adaptation and resilience.
Yeah, it's a great example. And you may not need to call it climate, you can just call it good business. But if you can take a holistic approach, what the art of the feasible is. I'm going to just go around and ask you also the same question, which is, what are you seeing on the pricing signals? And also, how do we think about taking it from a cost avoidance to an opportunity set? Just go around, yeah. Neely? Yeah.
So I'm so happy you ask about pricing because it's the core language in which finance speaks. And maybe sometimes when we talk about adaptation and resilience or even physical risk, it sounds kind of qualitative. And so you're getting down to the quantitative aspect. In nature-based solutions and in carbon markets, I actually wanted to come back to the topic that you raised about thinking in a more integrated fashion.
Yeah.
You remember how I was saying that nature-based projects that have adaptation and resilience qualities are they're just higher quality projects. And so you'll find among buyers a higher demand for such projects in the market. But you don't really see it in the price, not in an organized way. There's kind of a loose correlation between projects that have better water attributes, better biodiversity, better contributing to higher adaptation and resilience, but it's not, I can't tell you that the value of this is X dollars. On the other side, though, in the markets, you'll hear new ideas coming forward around things like specifically biodiversity credits or water credits that tries to put more of a specific price on these advantages. But what I would love to see is organization within the carbon markets that puts a price directly onto these benefits that just comes on top of the carbon price itself.
That would be the holy grail, yeah.
And then I also wanted to speak to insurance, which you mentioned, because it does offer the potential for clear price signals. There's one example from Munich Re that partnered with the Nature Conservancy on a project in Mississippi and the nearby states, the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. Here, they did a levee setback. You know, the risk of flooding, disastrous flooding in the Mississippi River in the U.S. is a very serious problem. So they did a levee setback, and then they embedded kind of coastal plantations of mangroves and seagrass and things like this to be able to shore up the flood risk. What they found is that the flood risk insurance premiums for homes and businesses nearby went down by 50%. And so now they're working to be able to put in place specific parameters around what the nature of that value is, and also to be able to bring it into pricing in adaptation bonds and resilience bonds, which you mentioned in your presentation, Rebecca. And we do need common taxonomies and standards for what the definitions are in that market. So I think that when you talk about insurance, but then also talk about improved insurance premiums, also improved interest rates in the bond market, that this starts to become interesting, and again is in the language that finance can understand, and we need to find more tools for that. The last thing I want to say on this, though, is that insurance, one of the challenges is that insurance contracts are annual. They get repriced annually. And so while insurers may have a sense of what the long-term cost curves and risk curves are for insuring different assets, the market doesn't always know what those forward-looking projections are. And so one thing that companies should think about is, and we should all think about, is how do we engage with the sector to gain a shared long-term understanding of what these costs will look like, so that we can take it into account in our financial decisions and in prices.
And I think you illuminated some of the challenges that we see in our day-to-day work as well, which is when we have some conversations with companies around how you're addressing physical risk, oftentimes it comes to insurance. But then we tell them, well, it's an annual thing. The cost of insurance can go up, but in some locations, insurers are pulling back. Right? So
No
you
signal.
can't depend on it. And then there's a time horizon as a long-term investor. There's these chronic but also very much, acute and chronic risks. And how do we think about the longer term risk is incredibly challenging. And I'm going to prepare some of my good friends. I see Yiling at MSCI, who actually held a closed-door conversation and is at the forefront of some of these data sets and working with investors. I'm going to ask you to share some of your perspective at the tail end. And I also see my colleague, Ning Min from Gen Zero, who's been investing into nature-based solutions and talking a little bit about some of the quality attributes in the absence of policy enabling these things to be monetized, that Nini mentioned, that would be the holy grail. I think we've invested into ratings and thinking about stacking some of these attributes. I'll come back to you at the tail end, so just be warned. I'm going to pull you into the conversation. But Rebecca, if you could just double-click into these things, and I'll come to Leslie in a minute. Yeah.
Sure, I'll just stay on the insurance piece just for a moment. There's a couple of great examples. So insurance costs and things, we're insured, we're covered. It's like, well, if your asset isn't resilient, insurance may go. There's a great example of a shopping centre in Hong Kong through Link REIT, and they worked with the insurer. They looked at what would make the asset resilient, and it lowered their insurance premium. And so there are some great examples in Vietnam. There's another shopping centre raised by over a metre. It's a resilient asset for the community. the investor, the companies inside, etc. Really, actually, shopping centres are becoming critical assets. So there's quite a few examples. There's hospitals in the US. There's a lot of those examples of building that resilience in. It is impacting, it's lowering insurance premiums. So I think there's a benefit there. But I think kind of on broader pricing signals, I think investors are looking for those overarching policy and regulatory signals and need to engage for that through the national adaptation plans, into the sector plans, getting down to that level of granularity. They need to have the confidence and the directionality of where that's going, including getting that into taxonomies. As we've heard, the ASEAN taxonomy is starting to embed that in there. So I think it's a combination of things. We've got bottom-up things that we're already seeing, some great examples. We've got to have that match with that top-down, the policy and the regulatory settings, so that it gives that broader, that larger institutional capital confidence. And how do we start to scale up, aggregate through bonds, more of these platforms, showcase these example case studies, use the example of FastP. How do we replicate that for adaptation resilience? So we've got a lot of those building blocks there, but we just need to lean in and replicate them and scale up for different investors with different risk appetites.
Just talking about taxonomy, the Climate Bonds Initiative does have a climate resiliency taxonomy, and Tokyo actually just issued the very first climate resilience bond. So just FYI, on top of, hopefully you all take a look at our report, and then MSCI and Gary has done also a report in the context of public markets as well, alongside the GIC one that you mentioned. So hopefully you all take a look at it. So Leslie, you mentioned parametric insurance as well, and you're doing a lot of innovative financing mechanisms to really, again, benefit the communities as well. So can you share some of your insights?
Sure, yeah. And this is really where I think philanthropy can shine, because as the saying goes, if it exists, it's possible, so make it exist. And we're trying to make things exist as an example that others can replicate. So parametric insurance is one of those examples I talked about very briefly. We're also experimenting with different bond formulations, and also through partners trying to influence, our partners are trying to influence through research and case studies how central banks actually can tilt toward green bonds to actually make it more attractive to invest in greener companies. And there's a whole bunch of examples there, but I think the role of philanthropy, and this is what we're trying to do, is demonstrate what's possible. And that's why our partnership with AIGCC is really important, because through them, they're able to actually show what just transitions, for example, look like for their investors and actually guide them with sort of the guidelines that they need to follow. What we found is that through some of our academic partners like LSE, we've set up the Just Transition Finance Lab. What we're trying to do there is actually showcase what's actually working and what's not working so others can learn from it. This knowledge goes nowhere if it's not taken up. So what's really important is that we need to show that there's a business case for this, but then also partner with organizations that have 35 trillion of assets under management, a lot of assets, who then can actually incentivize their members to take it up. So I think it's a very exciting time for philanthropy to play in this space. I would actually say that there's very few philanthropies that are playing in this space, and we need more.
I think well said. And what I found, I'm still learning more about insurance products, but what I found really interesting about parametric insurance is that after a risk event, when you need help ASAP, oftentimes insurance companies take time to understand and do the payout, versus parametric insurance, if you exceed a certain threshold, it's an immediate payout when the community needs it as soon as possible. So I think those types of innovations that philanthropy is helping to drive,
yes,
I think is absolutely paramount. If I may, before we go into policy conversations, and feel free to say no, because I know I'm literally calling you out from the audience, but can I bring you into the conversation, Yiling? Can we pass a mic? Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, you want to stand up? And
Yeah, sure. Okay.
A good friend and have been at the forefront at MSCI.
I have a question, as a follow-up to the insurance question. So thanks for giving me the opportunity. I'm Linda Yiling Lee. I'm head of the institute at MSCI. We're one of the largest sustainability and climate data and index company. and many of the large institutional investors are our clients. So on this particular topic, we recently had done a survey of 550 companies, public and private, across 15 different markets, large, medium, small. And one of the things that we found was that so many of them are have already been impacted by a range of extreme weather events. 80% of them, and it's really actually quite pervasive. And then surprisingly, many of them are actually taking very concrete steps. And the majority of them actually report that they're seeing some benefits either from when they've put in resilience measures, that they are attracting investor interest, as well as they're seeing it in insurance premiums. And so those are all very good news, and I think generally much more positive maybe than investors think in terms of just looking at their exposures. So a couple of interesting features, though, which tease up my question, which I haven't been able to ask anyone, so I hope somebody on this panel knows. So one of the things that we found is that the companies have tended to be quite reactive, right? So companies that have recently had weather events, are twice as likely to have upgraded their infrastructure. I mean, you just have to do it, so they're almost forced to do it. But the other thing is that when they said when we asked them what their time horizon was in terms of their investment planning, it was mostly over the next year, and then perhaps over 2 to 5 years, right? So no one actually kind of was looking beyond 5 years. The other thing is that many of them were we asked quite granularly what physical risks they were looking at. They were almost all acute risks, right? Even though we all know and have talked about the fact that it's the over time kind of chronic risks that would actually really kind of be an outsized impact. So my question is it partly because, can you insure against some of these more chronic risks, or is it just not a feature or an innovation? Because we can talk about parametric insurance. I mean, these are very event-based type risks, and I think that we can do more and more in that area. But if companies partly need to be thinking about it beyond that horizon, what are there insurance-related features that can actually help address the boiling frog, kind of a problem?
Does anybody want to tackle that tough question?
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, and I think I'm going to answer that parametric insurance will not address the risk that you're talking about, because this is very immediate. It's symptom-based. It gives immediate relief to allow people to actually not have to work in 45, 50-degree temperatures and then be able to go back and still be able to feed their family. So it is an immediate symptom-based thing. However, that said, there is a need to have that longer-term view, and we are all humans. We're, victims of our short-termism. One thing that we did a couple years ago is with Cornell's, we did a study to really understand what is the impact of climate on the fashion industry in 5 key producing cities in Asia. And unsurprisingly, it's going to hit FDI, it's going to hit labor, it's going to hit, economic growth, et cetera, et cetera. This was a 5 to 10 year view out. And we went on a road show and actually talked to every single stakeholder that's in that industry to say, this is what's going to happen in 5, 10 years. And it's kind of like a aha moment, but then what do you do about it? So then I turned to Rebecca, because she has an answer.
Kind of. I don't think anything on the insurance side. It's building resilience into assets over that long term. So if I think about the work that we've done with investors in Australia, the pension funds there, I now have a figure for that market. So collectively, Australian pension funds are going to be 40% down by 2050. So that crystallises their mind. It becomes very existential for them. So they've always had that long-term time horizon. They set up IGCC 20 years ago, and now it's materialising today, these impacts. So it's about how do they build resilience into these long-term assets, the infrastructure that Brookfield's looking at. How do we start that now? There's immediate reactive things, but we have to look for the long term. And I think this is an opportunity where global asset owners who do have that very long-term view, who look past geopolitical and other market-based cycles, they're investing for that long term. They've got people who are joining their fund at age of 20 in their first job who are retiring in 50 years. So they have to think that long-term view, and how will their portfolio be resilient, and then the assets within that. So I think you have to do both. Where are the impacts to your portfolios today, this year, next year? But you've got to have that much longer view, and then what are the policy signals around that, and then how do you build that resilience into frameworks, infrastructure, forward-looking assets, and particularly the big infrastructure assets. So I think it's, you need to have both, but global asset owners, and they are collectively sort of working together. How do we do this as a collective? And that's these massive pools of capital. That's all of our money, trying to do that.
I think it's a research opportunity. No, but I think it's a real thing where in some of the conversations that I've had, even government folks are saying, if I take adaptation resilience measures, is my sovereign credit going to be better? Is my insurance premium for all of my private sector companies going to be better? And how do I think about the long term? Albeit, the mitigation question is also an essential one. They go hand in hand, as you know, obviously, right? And the mitigation, greenhouse gas emissions know no borders. So this is where I do think, despite some of the geopolitical fragmentation, the coalition of the willing to be able to move the agenda forward, I think is going to be increasingly important. But I do think it's going to be a research agenda. Yes, please.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Julia from Petronas. It's a Malaysian national oil and gas company. So the way we're looking at it, and it's not myself, but it's my colleague that looks at it, but the way I think we're looking at it is threefold. So the first one is your physical risk right away. So that is that 5-year, 2-year, 5-year time horizon. And we're kind of looking at the major risks, right? The second step of how we're looking at it is the long-term, kind of 10 years, 15 years out, because we do have old assets. Our assets will continue for many years to come. So we do look at that long-term horizon as well. And when we look at that long-term horizon, we kind of broaden the risks of what we look at. So it's not just, heat or floods and so on, but we kind of have a broader perspective. And then we think about our new assets and kind of think, okay, what will be the physical risk coming into our new assets, and what do we need to embed even before we start thinking and we start operating these new assets in the long term, depending on where the physically, from a geographic perspective and so on. So that's a little bit how we think about it. Not to say that it's perfect. It's a step-by-step approach, but I do think that we do think long term. So.
And institutional investors are very mindful of the stranded asset risk. And so looking at that asset life cycle across all sectors is critical, because they're like, well, are we going to invest more capital into an asset? If it's not resilient, then we'll put our money elsewhere, if those signals aren't strong enough from the companies and the disclosure and that engagement coming through.
Thank you for sharing. Ming, can I ask you about the nature-based solutions and what you're seeing in terms of the different co-benefits?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Kyung-ah, for the call out. I'm Ling Min from Gen Zero, an investments company wholly owned by Temasek, and we look at investments into nature-based solutions alongside technology-based solutions. I did want to respond quickly on the commentary on insurance as well, because it has been a topic that we've been looking at. And the way we think about it is beyond sort of physical risks, it's also the delivery risks of the nature-based carbon projects. So we think about delivery risks. While physical and parametric risk is one aspect of it, there are other components around sort of registration delays, changes in carbon methodologies. All of this could roll up into delivery risks to the end buyers of the carbon credits. And the way we think, and there are other elements around country risk as well. So political risk insurance is also one aspect that we think about. And as an investor, the pragmatic approach to it is not to have a coverage that covers everything, because it'll be cost prohibitive, as we discussed. And it's much more important to think about the specific coverage that you're thinking about, the risk exposure, and also the size and quantum of it. So one aspect we think about is covering your capital at risk, for instance, the amount of investment quantum that you put into the project, but also covering the penalties associated with non-delivery or delayed delivery. For instance, if the project has entered into an offtake contract with a carbon credits buyer, the inability to deliver the credits at that point in time could incur penalties for yourselves. And therefore, the insurance coverage, again, you will want to size that according maybe to the quantum of the offtake contracts that you've thought about. Just a couple of thoughts on how to think about this topic on insurance. And back onto the topic on MBS projects, how we think about quality and the attributes associated with that, really on two levels. So I think there's the macro standard methodology level. Some of you may have heard about it already from the ICVCM, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, where they've published the core carbon principles. So around governance, around emissions impact, around sustainable development, including co-benefits. And within emissions impact, you're thinking about quality attributes around additionality, permanence, baselines. So that's at the methodology level. So investors and buyers today have a good reference on what you could look to be methodologies that have sort of achieved the CCP labels, if you like. And equally, then we need to look at it at the project level when we dovetail into the granularity for each project associated with the methodology that they're enrolling under. And that's where, Kyung-ah, you made a call out around ratings company in a very similar fashion to how we have S&P, Moody's for the financial markets. In the carbon project sector relating to nature-based solutions projects, we're also seeing the emergence of ratings agencies like the likes of B0, who will be evaluating the project and ascribing ratings associated to how their performance against the various attributes. Again, I think that's a very good mechanism for investors and buyers to think about discerning the quality across different projects.
Do they look at resiliency as a rating metric?
Yeah, for the time being today, a lot of the focus has been on the environmental integrity portion of it. So the carbon, as well as the co-benefits. So the robustness of your benefit sharing mechanism with the local communities, as well as biodiversity attributes. I think resilience is implied, but not a direct metric of measurement, implied in the way that you've undertaken environmental integrity of the project to ensure that you're at least doing no harm, no worse off than what happened before, and better yet, you're doing more to protect and restore the landscape.
I guess in some ways, nature-based solutions permanence, right, away from wildfire risk, etc. I guess in some ways that is a resiliency component of it, but we need to go above and beyond. But thank you both for sharing your perspective as well. So I'm going to ask one more question because we haven't dived in enough around the role of policy, even though you mentioned national adaptation plans, carbon pricing, as well as how do we actually try to bring monetization around some of these resilience and community attributes. But I want to double click and get a bit more into detail around, from your perspective, we'll just go around in the interest of time with a very quick response. What is the role of government that you like to be able to see, and how does that help you from a private sector perspective to do more? And coming back to this question around return on investment. Just quick lightning round, yeah.
Thank you. I think the role of government is critical. When it comes to things like infrastructure, there's always a link to the government. So for example, for CAPO, we work with the Singapore government and other governments in so many different areas. For example, we're working with the Singapore government on integrating carbon capture into our waste to energy plants. We're working on the possible development of an ammonia power plant. We work together with the Singapore government and with governments of other ASEAN countries to implement the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore power integration program, where renewable energy is exported and imported into Singapore through 4 countries. Clearly, these are all examples where the private sector has a role, but really the government also does provide the overarching landscape for us to look at some of these solutions.
So people will always think of the government first when it comes to adaptation and resilience because they see it as a public good. Just as you said with philanthropy, I think we should also be precise about which things require public finance and which can actually be done by the private sector. I wanted to recognize the paper that Temasek published with BCG on this topic, very specific, going into solutions that are just investable today in adaptation and resilience. You know, and then the next step for public finance is to think about how it can engage in public-private partnerships that de-risk private investment to be able to crowd it in. And then with the remaining precious public dollars, you can do what's needed the most. But obviously, financing things isn't the only thing that governments can do. We've all talked about the needs for better and better integrated standards and policies and frameworks. The widening adoption of ISSB, which includes TCFD principles, is a good example of that. And I think also signals. The government can also signal what good looks like in a way that gives other sectors comfort and incentive to move forward.
So, you know, in philanthropy, we like to talk about systems change. And core to systems change is changing the rules of the system. So that's the role of government. And it's really important on the rules side that the government can create the incentives and the disincentives to do this. An example, in Bangladesh, we've been able to get into the proposal going to the government a heat framework that will help the country understand the impact on its millions of garment workers. And if the government says this is important and incentivizes businesses to address it, then it will happen. So that's super important. But I think also the signaling is really, really important. It's not only guarantees and funding, but it's also signaling that this is the right direction and incentivizing that through some sort of tax incentive scheme. We're seeing that that's very effective. And these adaptation plans, like in India with heat, is influencing the rest of the region. Super important. And without that, we wouldn't be able to do the work that we're doing with the private sector.
I agree with all that. I think a lot of it's been said. It's the signalling is critically important, from NDCs to national climate risk assessments, taxonomies, the disclosure regimes, sector plans. So that's they're those critical high-level signalling, as well as the sort of the bottom-up blended public-private partnerships is really critical. But I think just on that point that you touched on, interdependencies, resilience, there's interdependencies at community level, at asset level, at governmental level. And so I think just to add that the transboundary risks that we need to now take into is obviously within a country, within a market, and all of those policy and regulatory settings. But markets have to talk to each other, because supply chains are not limited to one market. They're interdependent across markets. So really having a region-wide approach, trading partner approach through the ASEAN taxonomy is really critical. So this is some work that we're starting to get into and really trying to facilitate and get some comparability across different markets, who's doing what. That's why we did that baseline assessment. That's why we're doing across different utilities with MSCI about the report that I talked about that's coming out in a few weeks. So transboundary risks. And those interdependencies, so interdependencies of global supply chains right down to that regional level with communities, I think is, and the government coordination that's required to do that at all levels.
Can I just ask you to double click on that for a moment? Because I think there is a view that, climate mitigation and GHG emissions know no boundaries. But when it comes to adaptation resilience, it's very local and place-based. But you're alluding to the fact that it's very integrated systems risk issues, supply chain, which obviously can be, even though fragmentation right now, but despite that, the supply chains are still integrated. And then you mentioned transboundary risk, right? Country dependencies. Can you just talk about some examples where we need to be aware that there is actually transboundary dependencies, not just localized?
Well, I think from the investor perspective, I think supply chains are the easiest way to sort of visualize how that works. I mean, we saw back in 2010, it was the first example that I think woke everyone up that the Thai auto industry was flooded. Global implications for the auto industry. We're seeing that with chips, with water supplies in Taiwan. It affects the global industry for smartphones, EVs, everything. So that's what, and you see the disruptions, airports, can't get products out of a market. So, you can point to lots of examples that we're all very familiar with on a daily and weekly basis. And so I think that's the risks that investors think about, and those transboundary, because it's not one market that can do anything about it. It requires this partners, companies, investors, the policy settings. It has to be integrated. And when the gaps become very apparent, and that's when you start to try and plug the gaps and realize you've got to plug a number of gaps at the same time.
I wanted to make a quick point on that as well. You mentioned as well the geopolitical environment, reshuffling. It's interesting because I actually see an opportunity for adaptation and resilience thinking to come into the market right now because of the challenges that exist geopolitically. I've had some conversations with CSOs, Chief Sustainability Officers, that have been able to partner with Chief Operating Officers at this time as supply chains are being reevaluated, perhaps for other reasons, not just geopolitics, but going all the way back to COVID, where supply chains just became in focus for non-sustainability reasons. But once you're reshuffling them, you have the chance now to say, are these assets resilient? What are our supply chain partners doing to de-risk from a broad perspective? And at this time where there's so much going on around the world that sometimes we feel it's hard to keep climate at the top of the agenda, I love it when we find opportunities to assert climate opportunities also through other themes.
I'll just add, the US is having their own experience right now, but in Australia we had 10 years of, pretty toxic climate policy where resilience was the only thing we could actually talk about, and we could actually engage constructively with a government who stripped climate from, national sites and so on. So absolutely, it's an opportunity at a political level, but at a real sort of economy solutions level as well.
Do you want to?
Sorry.
I think maybe you wanted to add something. Yeah, no, resilience seems to be a common theme, and it kind of goes hand in hand with actual security as well, which is obviously the other common theme. I'm going to open it up to the audience to see if there are any questions or further comments that people want to share, because I know we have a very informed audience. Otherwise, I can keep calling people out. Please.
Yeah, I was just going to ask the panelists if there's any views. Obviously,
Do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Evan. Evan Guy. I'm with a consulting company called Global Counsel. My question is, the global goal on adaptation and the indicators around that are being negotiated here in Belém. Do you have any hopes for that, and how that translates and impacts this sort of discussion and the impact on investment and financing, and how that will help this equation?
Perhaps we can broaden the question and ask about metrics, if that's okay with you, right? Any perspectives on metrics? How do we measure for success on adaptation and resiliency? It's a very tough question, but we can brainstorm.
I guess just to go to that point, I think the reason that AIGCC put out investor expectations of national adaptation plans about 2 years ago now was to try and insert that private sector view of what is needed in these national adaptation plans to allow capital to flow. So I went through sort of earlier in the presentation around sort of some of the key aspects that that we're looking for, and so I think it's early days, and so I think governments working with private sector, bringing them into the conversations at all levels of policy and regulatory design, as well as investment vehicle design and the risk return profile that's needed for private sector investors or blended vehicles. So I think getting more into that conversation and hearing from that private sector voice, which is really only relatively recently come into that from a large institutional capital pool perspective. So we're a bit more engaged in that conversation, and being here and having events like this is an opportunity to try and influence and get people to hear about what is out there, where the appetite is from investors to try and support that process.
I guess one thing that's also interesting to think about on this front from the lens of the negotiations is we actually have 4 COPs where this topic will be relevant, right? So we're at this COP. You also have the desertification COP, which speaks to adaptation and resilience in water, which relates to food systems. You've got the biodiversity COP, and I've spoken about the ties between biodiversity and adaptation, and then also now oceans. And so I think we should also listen across the themes and the negotiations, back to your point on more integrated thinking, to see, to move from fragmentation in even the way that the Conference of the Parties system organizes itself around this and other topics into a more holistic approach.
I think the one thing I would add is, on the one hand, you need a integrated national adaptation plan and actually working country to country where there are interdependencies as well, right? But similar to transition, where you've now gone from, well, not all, but NDCs to transition pathways and bringing it down to the sectoral level. I actually feel on adaptation and resiliency, you almost have to bring it down to that level. We didn't even talk enough about food resilience. We talked a lot about infrastructure, but food resilience is going to be a massive issue, right? In the context of, you remember the secondary, tertiary implications, like the Arab Spring was triggered actually by wheat and drought, and several countries, including Russia, basically banning wheat export, and the price of wheat, which is a basic food requirement, in the Middle East went up, and that was a spark. I mean, there were underlying issues, but that was a spark, for example. And I think you're going to see more and more of these things. And so how do you actually bring that down into better planning, but then make that investable for private sector? When you start talking about food resilience, people go, I don't know what you're talking about. But there are actually quite a number of investments. For example, drought-resistant, adaptive, seeds. How do you think about localized opportunity for food resilience versus import-based? I think there's many things that you have to break it down to, and we're not even close to doing that, but that's, I think, where we need to head to, and then take an integrated perspective. It's not a metrics, but I do think we have to bring it down further and further to make it investable.
Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, hi. So very nice, session which is going on. So thank you very much for the inputs. I come from India. I'm Dr. Amit Kumar Thakur. I work with a renowned think tank, TERI, based in India, New Delhi. India has its own NDCs. We have our own targets, and we are progressing in that in a very proper manner. But also the development path also has been charted out. Our net zero goals are 2070 for the country. We at one side see the clean energy solutions, which has to be adopted and has to be implemented. On the other side, at the sustainability front, we are seeing the ESG, the environment, social and governance part, as a mandate. The regulator SEBI, in fact, is a regulator in India, Security and Energy Board of Exchange of India. So they have said for the top 1,000 companies, they have to become net zero within a time frame. And that leads to huge investment of resources, human resources also, and financial resources. So how do you think that, achieving net zero by company, either it has to be achieved by companies, government, and there has to be a lot of investment. So how do you see this whole process is more inclusive and more sustainable, so that the people who are less responsible for climate change are part of this whole story?
Maybe I can take that. Yeah, so I feel the pain, because that is exactly the question we asked ourselves when we started going deep into how do you accelerate transitions that are just, that are inclusive. We actually mapped every single initiative out there in the world that is funded by philanthropy that's trying to accelerate just transitions, and found that there's 3 things that need to be in place for people to be included. And the first one, they need to have agency. We find a lot of companies don't necessarily bring the workers, producers, communities, tenants, whoever those stakeholders are, along in the process and give them a voice. They need to be at the table. 2, they need to be included. That's kind of obvious. But 3, you need to have accountability, and accountability for the companies that hold themselves accountability, but also for the communities. And there's lots of models where this works well, but it takes longer, it's harder, and in a way you need kind of an orchestration. And that's what we're trying to do in philanthropy, is actually support the entities that can orchestrate. Entities like Swaniti in India that have great models for how you bring communities and business and government together to actually move in the same direction.
After you.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Manib. I'm with the FastP office. Thank you, Kyunga, and the panel. This has been fantastic. For someone who actually focuses on transition financing day in, day out, learning more about adaptation is really, really helpful. So first, a big thank you. We learned a lot. Second, I'm going to agree with one thing on signaling. I think government signaling is very, very important, and Singapore government is very good at doing that, right? And eventually they do put their money where their mouth is and actually deliver, such as FastP. So I agree with the signaling is required. The third one, and this is more an offer of support and also help, is that while we are trying to put blended finance and convince, we have plenty of catalytic capital providers such as Leslie for the transition finance, while we're still finding a challenge is getting the private folks on board, because the narrative around, as the minute people think of transition, Nili, you said that people think of adaptation as government, as spending and all the rest. transition is less so, but even then, getting private sector to put money there is tough. So I feel for when you bring in the adaptation financing discussion, I can see where the private sector runs towards, right? They just don't want to talk. So I think that offer on how do we get that narrative both for the transition financing to the private sector or adaptation financing is something that FastP would love to sort of at some point discuss with you and learn from yourself. Maybe what Kyunga said, FastP 2.0, 3.0 is going to be called FAP, Financing Asia's Adaptation Partnership. So with that, thank you.
Thank you for that. One more question, anyone? Please.
Thank you all for all your insights. Very, very helpful. I'm Professor Ting Lin at Global Sea Level Rise Model. I'm also a contributing author to the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction by UNDRR. So kind of overall topic, very, very much relevant, resilience pace, financing and investing for our future. So kind of curious, for instance, from sea level rise perspective and also some of your earlier question as well, how do I look into the short term versus long term? So one way inspiration could come from also a different field. For instance, an earthquake. So what we're experiencing right now, sort of going from hazard all the way to risk to impact on people, on infrastructure, on ecosystems, and kind of try to put a dollar sign on those from global or regional or local levels across time scales from 1 year insurance reinsurance horizon to 5-year, 10-year strategic plans to a century or kind of scale, sort of very scale, is to kind of tie in also those maybe short-term multi-hazards, how, for instance, sea level rises increasing, basically compounding flooding hazard versus long-term tying down for a sort of existential threat. So kind of curious from your perspective too, what would be the largest challenges kind of maybe from sea level rise perspective, in the area of sea level rise, from local to global level, from nature-based solutions to philanthropy, and all sort of all across private sector or public-private partnership. Thanks.
Thank you. In answering that question, I'm going to ask you to address that very quickly, but any last reflections as a conclusion as well, because you're almost out of time.
Thank you. I was actually going to respond to the earlier question from this gentleman here, and I'll come back to that later. But I wanted to be a bit more optimistic because I feel that ESG, despite the backlash we see in some markets, I think for many companies, they see value in being sustainable. I mean, just in terms of investors' preferences, in terms of staff motivations. Many staff in Keppel, we have a survey, and the staff are proud to work for a company that's contributing sustainability solutions. So I think that I think there is positive momentum, right, in the bigger scheme of things. Coming back to climate change and sea level rises, I think it's a challenge that companies have to deal with. For practical purposes, we will take steps such as raising the platform levels beyond existing levels to deal with rising sea levels. In areas that are more prone to flooding, such as Ho Chi Minh City, we would have very regular flood drills, right? And these are the measures that we try to mitigate those risks, mindful that a lot of the sort of like bigger solutions may not be executable at the asset or company level.
So, in a concluding thought and bringing together this both of these topic questions about short-term versus long-term, I think that one of the major challenges for long-term planning is that, the IPCC pathways that we have, they're scenarios, not forecasts. And I love how the IPCC overlaid the social scenarios on top of the warming scenarios in recent years, because the reason they're scenarios and not forecasts is because so much has to do with what we do and how we operate. And so then planning into the very long term becomes difficult. I think best practice is scenario planning, where you actually are looking at multiple different futures and thinking about how you'll respond in each of them. I can't tell you the exact answer to the biggest risk challenge for this reason. It really is local. Like, the biggest risk is different in different places. One that really keeps me up at night, though, is extreme heat. You know, especially when it's combined with humidity, because of the just immediate effects on human life, the way that it can contribute quickly to fatality. But to end on a more positive note, I want to come back to the scenarios and the social overlays. You know, the answers are up to us and what we do now.
Great, thank you. There's a great book called The Heat Will Kill You First, if you want something uplifting. Okay, so that's a huge question. I can't even begin to answer it. But what I did want to call out is what I would love to see, and this is the biggest barrier, is we need to change the way we think of value and what we value. And so when we talk about how philanthropy can help address this issue, a lot of that architecture I referred to is trying to change the way we value things. We, for example, I mean, you mentioned T and Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures. We're working on the Task Force for Inequality-Related Disclosures, which is yet another guideline to help investors understand the social side, and that's really important. But what I would love to see in a closing thought is, instead of talking about adaptation and resilience as a cost, it's actually an investment, and it's an investment in security, in productivity, in profitability, and stability. And so it's something we need to do, and it actually is a very positive thing.
I guess just to your question in terms of sea level rise and risk, we engaged with some banks in Asia a couple of years ago, and what we found is they're using the wrong data. They're not using granular enough data, and they're saying, oh, we're all okay with 1 metre sea level rise. We're like, well, actually, what if you looked at 5 metres plus? So that's starting to change, because we're getting better data sets. We're pointing out, you know, that they probably need to do some different scenario analysis and look at different scenarios and more extreme scenarios than what might be considered palatable depending on the bank and their exposures and so on. So I think that's that. We talked about sort of data gaps and so on and how to address that before. But I think weaving these things together, we can't think about adaptation resilience in a silo. We don't have time for that. We need to look at transition as with adaptation, and we need to do that because the assets don't distinguish between being resilient, heats, floods, and transition. And you've got to transition old assets into the new assets in a flooding zone, or to adapt to heat stress, or whatever it is. So you can't separate them in the physical world, so we can't separate them on paper. So how do we integrate mitigation, adaptation, just adaptation into that? We have to do it all, because we're seeing pushback at a local level where people aren't involved, they're not consulted, they're not being included in how this is getting done. And you can actually, I think, to try and finish on a positive note here, empowering people brings the solutions. We're all human beings. We know what lethal humidity can potentially do to us today, but more broadly speaking, so how do we bring the solutions to our food, our agricultural systems, which connects into the logistics, the supply chains, the trucks, which go to the airports, which feed into global supply chains. We are part of the system. We are the system. So empowering each actor in the system. And I think events like this here, this is where we talk about the solutions, hear the solutions, get inspired, get empowered to bring everything together. So COP is a massive accelerant and a point of leverage for us to use. So it's up, call to action is for everyone to take things you've heard here that might be new, take that into negotiations if that's where you are, or take it to your country platforms and markets, because this is the opportunity. This is why we're all here.
I think it was well said, and for me, I think you illuminated how are we really moving from the value protection now towards value creation. We need the price signals. We need partnership and taking an integrated approach, certainly from policy, but private sector, but also integration in terms of how we think through not only nature, but infrastructure-based solutions and across the sectors. And I think importantly, someone said very wisely in one of our Sustainability Council meetings, there is no adaptation in a 3-degree world. And right now, the latest numbers I saw is 2.8 degrees. Somewhere around 2.8 degrees is where we headed. So we've got to remember that we have to transition alongside adaptation. The two go hand in hand. It's not an either or. And we also have to think about the long-term time horizon, but immediate actions as well. So I just want to end on a call to action that we have to do both. And that we have the opportunity and the solution sets to be able to do so. But thank you to all of our esteemed panelists. Thank you all for being here in this heat and humidity as well. And hopefully we have many more positive conversations and a call to action as well. Thank you.
Thank you.